among other programs we're working on. So we want to definitely give thanks to our funders that have allowed us to do more than we would normally do at a solid waste district. Also just wanted to remind folks that this is a step up from our compost basics, which is a webinar that Theron and I have been offering since last spring, and we will be sending you a link to the recording of that. When you'll get a follow-up email from us, and we'll include that. But we won't be talking about basic composting. We're assuming that everybody who's logged on today has already been composting for at least a year, or probably a lot longer than a year. If you did get on here and you haven't been composting that long, stick around, you'll learn a lot, but we aren't gonna go through the basics. We will, however, make sure that you get the information, and we'd love to see you again at a different webinar. But please do stick around, because you know, a lot of the composting through the winter is less about how to compost and more about how to strategize, you know, managing food scraps in the cold weather. The last thing I wanted to do is just a quick housekeeping tips. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom webinars by now. There's a Q&A box and a chat box, and Amanda is our question master today. So she'll be keeping an eye on both of those boxes. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and Amanda will take a break in the middle, and then we'll take a break at the end, and we'll just focus on your questions. In the middle, we'll answer a couple questions, and if you have things to share that aren't a question, but ideas or tips or comments, the chat box is a really good place for that. Theron, Amanda, do you want to say hi before we get started?
Hello, I'm Theron. I'm the outreach coordinator, and this is, yeah, this is exciting. This is the first winter composting webinar we've done, so.
I'm Amanda. I'm the Eco AmeriCorps member for the district this year. And yeah, it's nice to be here.
Yeah, and I'd also like to just point out the three of us are all graduates of the UVM Master Composter course. And Theron and I have been teaching composting, training on composting, and actually composting for collectively decades, I would say. So you're in good hands. Okay, Theron's gonna get us, I'm just gonna briefly go through the overview, and then Theron's gonna take it from there. Uh-oh, that's not what's supposed to happen. There we go. Okay, so Theron's going to talk to you about Vermont's Universal Recycling Law, Act 148, and some basics of food scrap diversion, including all the options that are available that aren't composting. If you go through this and it really doesn't seem viable for you to compost in your backyard through the winter, Theron's going to have a lot of ideas for you. And also some real nitty-gritty details about why we compost in the first place. And then I'm going to go into some tips and strategies about how to compost, everything from how to get out to your bin to what to do with your bin, and other ways that you can set up your food scrap and composting collection during the months when everything freezes. And then the three of us will be available for a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to hop off and let Theron take it from here.
All right, welcome everybody. So as I'm sure you all know, there is the Act 148 Universal Recycling Law, which includes the requirement to keep food scraps out of the landfill. Now, it covers a couple different things, including the statewide 6 recyclables: paper, cardboard, glass, steel, aluminum. It also covers leaf and yard waste and a couple of other things that have higher and better uses and that can be recycled that in a way that doesn't require us to use up valuable landfill space. So, Cassandra, if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk about the specifics of the Universal Recycling Law. So, it's been phased in. It started out as a requirement for businesses and large generators of food scraps, say supermarkets and restaurants. Started as a requirement for them to divert their food scraps, and that started out back in 2014, and it progressed through 2017 based on the size of the generator, how much food scraps they were producing in tons. So, and then it's worked its way down to everybody since July of this year, everybody has been required to divert their food scraps and keep them out of the landfill. So to achieve that, the state of Vermont, the haulers, the waste districts, we've all been working to make it really easy to make sure everybody has access to some kind of food scrap diversion system. And as you can see, there are a number of options, and we're working hard to make sure everybody knows that there are options and help them figure out what the best one is for them. So at every transfer station in the state, there is a drop-off for food scraps, and that's usually a big tote that you can bring your food scraps to. And I know that that the one that I go to charges a small fee. I think that's pretty much universal, but there's also a number of commercial composting facilities, such as Vermont Compost and Grow Compost in Montpelier and Moortown, respectively. And they don't charge anything for your food scraps. If you bring them right there, you can dump them for free, and they will turn them into compost. So there are options for drop-offs. Some of those commercial composters also offer community drop-offs. So they'll put a compost tote or a food scrap tote in a public location that people can then bring their food scraps to. Obviously, if you have space, backyard composting is also a great option. It does take a little bit more time, and you have to manage it yourself. So it's more a little bit more involved, but as we'll discuss, it's very much worth it. And and if you can, I'd highly recommend it. So aside from that, there's also a number of community composting sites throughout the district and the state. These are places where a number of neighbors or maybe an organization has set up a larger system that can accommodate the needs of multiple families, say an apartment building or a homeowners association. In some cases, it's just an organization that that has a lot of visitors and decided that they wanted to manage their food scraps on site. So there's a few options there. And if you want to compost, but you don't have the space, you can also check in with a neighbor. If a neighbor has a really nice compost system set up, and their system could manage the waste from two families, then there's no reason why they couldn't. So it's worth asking. Here in this picture is an image of the Vermont Compost drop-off site. This is just outside of Montpelier, and up on the hill, you can see there are those 3 big totes for food scraps. And then there's a barrel of cover material, which is a carbon input. It's usually some sort of wood shavings mix. And that helps absorb some of the smells and some of the liquids and keeps the flies and other things down. So they've made it really nice and convenient for people to come by. So the important thing to think about when we're talking about composting is it's not required, but we are asking everybody to keep their food scraps out of the landfill. And before we compost, there are a number of other steps that we should be thinking about and taking to reduce the amount of wasted food in the first place. So you can see on this hierarchy that composting is way down at the bottom. Before we compost the food, we want to see if there are other options for it to be used that are more productive. So it takes a lot of energy, a lot of water, a lot of resources, and a lot of time, and a lot of money to grow and create food. And so if we're able to, in the first place, reduce the wasted food, the food that never makes it to a consumer, that's really good. We want to make sure that everything that's grown, or as much of what is grown as possible, is then able to be used in the first place. So food for people, that's really the goal of growing food, isn't it? After that, we can feed animals. Animals can eat food even if it's maybe gone off or isn't good for humans anymore. I'm thinking here of chickens, of pigs, of other domestic animals that, like I know that some people, if they have meat that gets freezer burned, they'll feed it to their dogs or something like that. So that's another thing to do before composting it. Composting it is really, it's a way to turn a wasted resource into a valuable resource. And it is a good thing to do, but like I said, we want to try to avoid wasting food in all ways before we get there. So part of the reason that the universal recycling law includes food scraps is because of the impact that they have on our landfill and on our environment as well. The last waste study, the waste analysis that the Department of Environmental Conservation did, 21% of the trash in Vermont was food scraps. So that takes up a lot of space. It's heavy, it's smelly when it rots in the trash, as you know, and we only have the one landfill in Vermont. So if we can take almost a quarter of the waste that we're producing and manage it in a different way that's more effective, that doesn't produce methane, that doesn't end up creating nasty sludge by rotting in the compost or rotting in the landfill without oxygen, it's a really good thing to do. It'll also make the landfill last longer. As you know, we only have one, so it's important that we work to do that as well. And on top of all of this, like I said, if you're able to take that wasted food, those food scraps, and turn it back into a valuable resource to build the soil and to help things grow, that becomes very valuable. So if anybody has some other suggestions or ideas about why they compost, I'd love to hear those in the chat. We'll read those off in a little bit. The next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the methane that is produced when food scraps break down in the landfill. So in the landfill, everything gets covered and squished, which creates an anaerobic environment. So there's no oxygen, and the food scraps will not compost in that environment. They need oxygen, and they need biological activity to actually break down as they should, which is by composting. But it's not possible in the landfill environment. So what happens is they sort of putrefy and create methane, which is a much more powerful heat trapping greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And in terms of Vermont meeting its climate goals and its greenhouse gas reduction goals, this is a very important step to achieving that. All right, so why do we want to compost in the winter? If you're composting in the summer, there's no reason not to compost in the winter. The food scraps and the other inputs that you put into your compost bin in the winter, they might freeze solid, and that's okay. They will thaw out eventually. And the important thing to remember about all this is that as soon as the temperature gets above 32 degrees, the microbes and the bacteria and the microorganisms that are working on those food scraps to break them down into that composted material, they're going to reactivate and they're going to start doing their work again, and your food scraps will continue to compost. Even on, say, a warm day in February, if it gets above 32, it's going to start happening again, which means that by the time spring comes around, your compost will be well on its way, or your food scraps will be well on their way to becoming compost and becoming that valuable resource, that nutrient-dense material that you can then use to build your soil, to help grow your plants, your lawn, your property. And the important thing about all of this is also that you're able to like I said, you're taking that wasted resource, you're turning it into something valuable, and you're also keeping all of those nutrients, all of that biological activity that is able to be created through that composting process. You're keeping that local, you're keeping that at your home, at your property, and on the land that you are living and working. So that concludes my section. Amanda, Cassandra, do you want to hop on and we can maybe answer a question and hear about some reasons why other people compost?
Amanda, do we have any questions?
Yep, so we've got 3 questions. So the first question has to do with what I think is a common misconception with Act 148, which is how do you know whether people are including food scraps in their trash or not?
You want me to take that one, or do you want to?
Why don't you take that one, and if I have anything to add when you're done, I'll add it.
Okay. The short answer is we don't, but that's not really the point. What we're trying to do is make it easy for people to actually divert their food scraps. We're trying to make sure they know how and where, and also the reasoning behind it, why we're planning on diverting our food scraps, what the impact is for our resources, our waste management practices, and our state ultimately.
I don't have anything to add. That was well said.
Okay. The next question is from Barbara, and it says, how often do the bins at drop-off sites have to be emptied?
I'll take that one. They're usually emptied weekly. I can't speak to the commercial composters that have like the rows of bins out for people. I know that Vermont Compost, you can drop off your food scraps 24/7. As long as those are available, like those of us who actually use those service, we don't have to worry about them getting emptied. They have either the weekly schedule or the commercial composters are managing it. That's a good question, and weekly is usually plenty.
All right. The last question we have is has to do with ice sealing the compost bin. So this person says the last few winters we've been put off composting in the winter because it was impossible to open the compost bin to put new things in. Ice seems to form in place when the top and bottom is connected. They say they got a black plastic bin from the Chittenden Solid Waste Management District. I'm assuming maybe that's a soil saver, but maybe not. Any tips to keep the mechanism working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually a segue question because we're going to go into more of that granular detail in this next section. And I'll give a stab, Theron, and then I want to hear your response too. But my strategy for that is that I do not use the locking mechanisms in the winter. I've had the same thing happen. If you have anything that slides or moves to hold the cover in place, that will ice up in the winter. And I think it stays in place without that latch being latched. I don't think it's so important that it's latched that I just keep it in. I keep them closed so I don't have to worry about what happens when there's ice, or I'll set it loosely on top of the bin. Do you have anything to add to that, Theron?
Well, it's just a suggestion that if your compost system freezes shut, or if you can't get to it because there's 3 feet of snow or whatever, we are going to talk about some other ways to do that and to manage those concerns. But remember, you can always go to any transfer station in the state and they will take food scraps, and there are a bunch of different options. So you don't have to compost in your backyard. If if the winter is a barrier to you composting, that's okay. There are other options.
Let's hold the rest of it. I saw one more question come in, and then I think we should.
It's more of a comment. It's just Linda was saying that she thinks it would be a great idea for grocery stores to have food scrap drop-offs because it would encourage people to drop them off more. So
I like that.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
I forgot to mention that that another option that a lot of new companies are offering is curbside hauling for food scraps. So if you're in an urban area like Montpelier, you may be able to find a provider that would haul food scraps from your door.
Yeah, when we send you you'll get a follow-up email from us. We will include a link. We have a page on our website where we have a list of all of the curbside food scrap haulers in our district. So you'll get a link to that in a minute. Well, after the webinar's over. You'll also get a link to the recording of the webinar. Let's move on. We're going to actually start talking about some of these more granular details, like how to manage your bin and some of the obstacles that can come up that have stopped a lot of us from composting through the winter. So I'm going to start talking about just how to do it. How do we get started with, getting through the winter with all of the obstacles that we have? But first, I'm actually going to open up a poll. Let me see if I can do this right. Okay, here we go. This is just a yes or no question. How do you compost in the winter? Yes or no? And we'll have another poll where you can talk about exactly why if for those who don't, why you don't. I mean, it looks like a lot of people at least have tried composting in the winter. That tells me that maybe some of you have tried it and had obstacles, like the person whose latch kept freezing shut in the winter. Yeah, so let's see, I don't know if this will show up for you, but it looks like 87% of the folks, 89%, let's see, I think I can share this. 89% have tried it and 13% have not. Okay, so one more poll. This is new for me. Let's see if I can, no, I don't know if I can get to the next poll. Well, okay, let's see. Okay, I'm sorry, this is still new for me to do more than one poll. Yeah, I'm not figuring out how to do it. Oh, here it is. Okay, forgive that. Okay, the next question is, why or why not have you, basically, why have you, for those of you who are not composting now, whether you've tried it or have never done it, why? And honestly, the polling doesn't allow open-ended questions in Zoom, so I put together some of the obstacles that I know of. If it's an other that, if you don't see your answer, feel free to put it in the chat box. I'm just trying to get a sense of, what the obstacles might be. I'm seeing a lot of people not liking how food freezes and the food scraps freeze and overflow in the bin. That seems to be the highest number so far. We have 30 more seconds. I'm actually we didn't rehearse this, but I'm gonna ask when we're done for Amanda, if we have any chats, any comments in the chat from people to hop on and just tell me what those comments are about why people may not be composting through the winter right now. And if there aren't any, that's fine. Oh, there's a bunch of them. Okay. Yeah, Amanda, why don't you pop on? I'm going to end the poll and share the results and tell me what people are saying about why they're not composting through the winter.
All right. So David says that he lived in another state through the winter. He would have composted, which I think is common in this area. Susan says that it's too cold. Problem with the cover again. Snow just makes it a hassle to put it in the bin. And Kathleen says that when the ground freezes, it's icy and it's too dangerous to get to her compost bin. So similar.
That's all legit, yeah. And I think, can you all see the poll? I just shared the results. It looks like the largest number, the number one reason in this group is that the people are finding that when they do compost through the winter, they're having their food scraps freeze and it's overflowing the bin. And that's not good. That's basically feeding the animals in your neighborhood at that point, and not in the good way. Too cold is common. The bin's far away from the house. A really important one is it's not composting, so why bother? And we're going to talk about that, exactly that. And then there's a few of you who aren't sure how to do it. So I wanted to open it up to hear from you what your obstacles are. And I've put together some of the most common ones that I know of. I actually forgot that one about the latch freezing or icing over. That's a really good point. And there's two solutions that we'll talk about, one of which is the one that I suggested, which is just don't lock it in the winter so that you don't need to have to manipulate the latch if you have a composter with a latch. We'll talk about some other solutions in a minute. First of all, so these are the obstacles that I guessed. It's just cold. A lot of people just don't want to go out in the cold and icy. And somebody had said that was their reason. And I've heard that a lot. And I do just want to emphasize that there are people for whom falling down in the ice is a real disaster. If you think you could break a bone, or if you're frail, or if you just, ice is not safe at all for you, I am not, I think that a drop off at a transfer station or compost site or a curbside pickup is probably a good option rather than risk it. If you're someone who wears yak tracks, or you're sturdy, or you're comfortable being outside, you know, there are some solutions for dealing with ice. The bin too far away is a common one. Some people site their compost system fairly significant distance from their house, and it's not practical to shovel a path. The bin overflowing with food is a big one, and we're going to go into how to avoid that. So this is an overview of some of the solutions. And this first one, reframe, I offer this, I don't mean to be pat or coy, I'm just, and as a suggestion, just for when it becomes an obstacle, just because it feels like a slog. And I think we can all relate to that. It's cold out, maybe it's slushy out, maybe it's icy out, and you've got this food scraps and you got to deal with them and nobody feels like it. I'm just offering a suggestion to reframe how you think of that, and kind of imagine that your little trip out to your compost bin is your way of getting 5 or 7 minutes of exercise in a time of the year when we often don't get as much exercise as we want to or should. Just a little extra invigoration for your body. It'll be bracing. It won't take very long, and you'll have moved around, and, you know, maybe you'll have to shovel. Maybe you'll have to, you know, walk a little distance. There is also ways to make it so it can be, if not fun, at least less of a slog. One of those is to actually use your snowshoes if you have snowshoes. That does deal with the ice situation if you have the ones with those crampons on it. I actually used to live in a rental where there was a compost bin not very far from the back, but it was about, you know, like a little walk, and it was up a steep hill. So I would actually strap on my snowshoes and drag the sled behind me, and I'd tromp up the hill, deal with the food scraps, and sled back down to the house. I'm not sure if everyone has that situation. I have never had it before or since, but that was just my way of kind of like making it a little bit less of a chore. So that's what I mean by reframe. But there's also some things you can't reframe that are just real, like the food scraps freezing and overflowing and that kind of thing. So one solution for that is to have a temporary compost bin or compost storage that you use just in the winter, and then you manage it in the spring. And we're going to talk about a couple ways to do that. One is just a temporary, like a trash can or a rolling cart that becomes your temporary winter compost that you can use, just have it on your backyard. Another is bokashi, and I'll go into more detail of that later. And then finally, whatever you're doing, start the winter with an empty bin. And I mean that like right now. Today is November, what's the date? 18th, 19th. This is the time to make sure, if you don't already have an empty bin to start with, if you think you're really going to do this winter, either, you know, make sure you have an empty bin, or if you have to get a new one or build one quickly, this is the time to do that. I'm going to start talking about that when we go into more tips, because the empty bin is really the primary thing. There's all these other factors that are important, but it's how you can manage that issue of the food scraps freezing. And the reality is that you're not really composting. And this speaks to, there was one person who said, yeah, it's not composting over the winter anyway, so why bother? Well, that is true, and it's not true at the same time. It's not, there isn't the biological activity that we see in the spring, summer, and fall. But what you're doing when you're composting over the winter is you're really storing your materials so that they're ready as soon as the temperature gets over freezing, just like Theron talked about earlier. And it means that you're set up. So everything's all in place. And as soon as that temperature gets up, your composting is, you don't have to do anything. The microorganisms that do all the decomposing are there and they're ready, but the temperature just has to be above freezing. And for that reason, you will notice, just like in the other parts of the year, if you start filling up your bin in the winter and everything's frozen, so it fills up pretty quickly, you get one day or one afternoon when it goes above freezing and it starts working. It'll start decomposing and your pile will shrink down. And then it will freeze in place, it'll fill up, and we'll have 1 day or 2 days when it's above freezing, it'll shrink down. So that's part of the process of winter composting. So if you're going to start with an empty bin, ideally you would have a minimum of 2 bins. And I say minimum because it depends on who you are, what your family size is. But for most households, a 2-bin system is just about right. 1 bin where you're adding fresh materials, and 1 bin where your compost is, has been through the process and is resting or curing. I actually have 2 bins, plus I have a tumbler. So I start my materials in a tumbler, then I put them into the bin for adding, and I let them compost more in there, and then I turn them into the curing bin and they rest for a few months. I use these holidays as kind of points in time that keep me anchored. So around Halloween, meaning at the end of October, is a good time to start thinking about moving your materials around so you have an empty bin. So that would mean you harvest your compost that's been curing in 1 bin. And for me, that meant I had a bin that had been just beautiful compost that was almost a year old that I finally harvested, and I put it on my garden beds. So now my garden beds are all set up for the spring too. And now I have an empty bin. And then and then you're going to turn your other bin. I'll show you photos in a minute about that. And then I use Easter as an anchor date, just to think of, I think April is about the right time to take all the material you've been working on all winter long, and you're going to turn that, add more browns, and then let that rest. So here's what I'm talking about for my system, but there's, dozens of varieties of this. This looks pretty pathetic, I'm aware. These bins are pre-made bins that I actually bought around the year 2000 from the Lamoille Solid Waste Management District. At the time, they were selling them for, very inexpensive, and I've been using them ever since. And honestly, those were my first compost bins. I did the open pile method until then. So the bin on the left, just a short story, is very raggy looking because we had a long story, but basically my husband accidentally sideswiped it with his truck. And I think that this winter will be the retirement winter for this bin. This is the bin where I've been adding the fresh materials, and mostly that's materials that have already been started in my tumbler. And this bin is the bin where I had materials that were curing. So that's the basic concept of using 2 bins. One, you regularly add fresh materials and browns, and the other is just the older stuff that's resting or curing. And I say resting or curing because those are slightly different processes, but they can also be the same. And this is the inside view of my bin, the bin 1, where I have been adding materials. And you can see it's not finished, but there's no recognizable food in there either. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to give it a good turn. I'm going to add a layer of either leaves or wood shavings, and then I'm just going to cover it up and leave it for the winter. And that's going to sit there all winter. I'm not going to touch that until next March or April. And that will be probably ready to use, or within a few weeks of being ready to use next spring. And this is the bin that I just emptied of the finished compost. And that finished compost that went on my gardens, now I have this empty bin. And this is what I'm going to use to start winter composting. I wanted to pull in close here because I want you to see that this hardware cloth lining. So for these kind of like pre-made bins that are open to the ground, it's really important. It's important that your materials touch the ground because they are getting all those microorganisms that are already in the soil. But it's also important that you set up some kind of mechanical barrier for animals. And this is how I do it for the pre-made bins. I have a layer of hardware cloth, and it comes out around 6 or 8 inches around the diameter of the bin. So animals that try to dig up under don't get in. And I think just as an added security level, before I start filling this, I'm actually going to put another layer of hardware cloth on the inside as well. And then before I add food scraps, I'm going to put a layer of about 3 or 4 inches of my browns at the bottom, and then I'll add the food scraps. And I have a lid that isn't in the photo, but it's really important to also cover it with a lid. This is another added way to keep animals out. So I've mentioned browns a few times. And again, I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume, but I am assuming that folks here are already composting and you know what browns are, but just in case you haven't been using them, when I say browns, I'm referring to carbon-rich materials like dried leaves, wood shavings, mulch hay, dry animal bedding, straw, anything like that is just a carbon-rich, literally, it's usually actually colored brown. And you need to stockpile those to get through the winter. It doesn't mean you have to have like a shed that's just only for your browns, but knowing now what you're gonna have for your browns all winter long is really important, because it might mean you go out and you buy a bale of wood shavings. It might mean, like me, you scrounge, and I happen to scrounge. These are bags of leaves. You know, whenever I see bags of leaves someone's left on the side of the road, I pick them up until I don't need them anymore. And they're great for putting your garden beds to bed for the winter. You know, I use them for that. And I also save some for my compost bin. I actually prefer wood shavings, but dried leaves are free. And you can shred them if you want to by mowing over them or using a leaf shredder. But just as a warning, one thing that does happen when you use leaves, you can see that these are whole. Probably these look like maple leaves to me. They will pack down a little bit in your compost bin. So when you add your food scraps, you're going to add leaves, and you're going to add food scraps, and you're going to add leaves. And because, you know, this is going to be over the winter, you won't really be able to turn it as much, and you will get a packed down layer of leaves. Just know that. So when you do get a chance to turn it in the spring, or if we get a warm spell in the winter, just know that you're going to need to make sure that you break up those leaves if they do pack down in your compost pile. And another option is wood shavings. So you can get these free at most wood shops or lumber mills. They usually give them away or sell them for very little, very, very little. I know that there's a timber frame company on Route 12 in Montpelier that actually you can pick up wood shavings there. Theron gets his wood shavings from a wood shop in Barrie. I've done both, but this time around I actually bought a bale of wood shavings. And so this is the packaging it came in. You can get these at most farm and garden stores for less than $6, including tax. So I'd say it's about $6 once you add in tax. And it lasts a couple months or longer, depending on how often you're adding food scraps to your pile. I kept this just as an aside. I normally would dump this whole bale into, this is a 32-gallon Rubbermaid tote. That's what I use for my brown storage. Normally I would dump it in the bin entirely, but there was a little moisture at the bottom of the bin that I didn't have time to air out. So I kept it in the plastic because I want the browns to stay dry. You can still use them when they're wet, but they're not really as effective. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is to make sure, and again, I might be saying something everybody already knows, but people do tend to like skip this part in the winter, so I'm emphasizing it. Make sure if you don't have it, you have something with a cover that you're using for your browns all winter long. And this is a picture of Theron's system. This is actually a 2-bin system that Theron designed with a coworker, and we actually have the plans on our website. We can add that to our list of things we send you after the webinar. But I like it as this is built with the same style as a 3-bin system, but it's 2 bins, which is a really appropriate size for a household. And you can see all of the elements I've been talking about. Here's the bin where they add the fresh food scraps and material. Here's the empty bin. So, you know, at some point in the future, I think this is the first year of use in this, I think, that at some point in the future, there might be curing compost in the second bin. But it means they can start their winter off with an empty bin. And here he has 2 bins of browns that are there ready to use and full, and a scoop. So every time you add the food scraps, you add 3 times as many browns. So just because my style is to hammer home the point, don't forget to keep adding carbon all winter long. Did I say that already? I guess so. And make sure that you are thinking about, so this is sort of a summary. Make sure you have something, leaves, wood shavings. I've seen posts on Front Porch Forum about mulch hay being available. That's perfectly acceptable. Brown. and make sure they're in a covered container next to your bin, and use them in a 3-to-1 ratio, just like you would spring, summer, and fall. You still do it in the winter. It's going to freeze, it's going to bulk up, but if you start with an empty bin, that's okay. And just as one more example, this is actually one of the bins that we put in place. We set up some community composting sites around the district. Darren talked about those earlier. I think this one is actually right in downtown Montpelier. It's a 10-unit condo association. I do want to point out, and you can see it's labeled. So this is multiple households are using this. So everything has to be labeled. And this says add 1 scoop of browns for every 5-quart pail of food scraps. And then it has the image. The reason that is because this was actually going into a tumbler, and your browns to greens ratio is different in a tumbler. But you could make a sign like this with the ratio that you want in your bin, so other people in your household know what to do. So if you're not the only person bringing food scraps out, you know, sometimes having signage is great just for your own household. So I see questions and comments coming in, which is great. We're going to get to those. I'm going to go through the next couple slides, and then we're ready to just chat and answer questions. But I do want to talk about a few other strategies. And I also just want to point out that you notice, other than like really emphasizing the browns to greens ratio, I'm not really talking about how to compost here. I'm just talking about how to set up mechanically, how to set up your system. Because that's really what the winter composting is about for me. It's about making sure I have the empty bin, making sure that I'm sort of ready to shovel a path, or I've located my bin where it's not too far of a path, or I've set up that temporary bin. So these are some more strategies with that in mind. One strategy is to insulate your bin, and people put insulation on the outside and they put insulation on the inside. And then there are some bins that already come insulated, like this tumbler down here, which I'll talk about more in a minute. I will say that insulating your bin, what it does is it gives you a little bit more time in the shoulders of winter. So you have a little bit more time in the late fall and early winter before everything freezes solid, and you have a little bit more time when you get into the spring. But it's not, even insulating your bin isn't going to ensure that you don't have frozen solid food scraps at some point during the winter. I think we have to, when we live in as far north as we do, we just have to deal with that reality. But I encourage you to try insulating your bin, because it does a lot of good, not just for sort of extending your season before things freeze, but it also, when you're in the warm seasons, it will help your compost heat up really fast, and you can actually get into thermophilic composting in a way that you might not be able to otherwise. Also, the temporary bin, which I'm going to show you a picture of a trash can composter, is a very simple concept, and it's a really nice strategy for dealing with if you just don't have another way to do it. Green cones are a good option because they're in-ground solar digesters. So even in the winter, they keep working. They slow down tremendously. And I didn't include a photo of a green cone here. It's kind of late in the year to add one this year, but if you like the idea, you should think about getting one in the spring when the ground thaws. But they're really nice because they use the heat from the sun to contribute to the underground decomposition. And they actually even fertilize the soil around them. But I would say that if your only form of managing food scraps is green cones, and you have more than one person in your household, you may need 2 green cones to get through the winter instead of 1, or a green cone paired with a compost bin. And lastly, I'm going to talk about bokashi composting. That is a little bit out there, but I like it as a way to delay, to sort of cut down on the number of times that you have to go out to your compost bin over the winter. So first, I'm just going to show some photos. This photo is one way that somebody has insulated their bin. You can see that they've just literally just wrapped this like reflective insulation, it looks like 3 layers. Maybe there's more we don't see. And it's wrapped with bungee cords. What I like about it, it's pretty low tech. The advantage is it's holding some warmth in, but the disadvantage is, of course, that the reflective layer is going to reflect sunlight off. So you do lose that benefit of the black absorbing the heat from the sun. So it might end up being sort of a neutral thing to do when all said and done. I just want to go back to that, but that doesn't mean you can't do this idea with a different kind of insulation that's not reflective. Here's the same concept, except it's a foam board and they put it inside the bin. And just also, this is actually a vermicomposting system, not a regular compost bin, but it's actually a little bit fancy looking for a bin. And you can see how, you look on this front edge, there's no sliding boards or door or anything. It's not set up for you to like turn, but nonetheless, you could do this kind of thing in 2-bin or 3-bin system. If you have a square, even a pallet system, you could even add a couple layers of the foam board and really maximize the insulation. And you notice it's like all layers. I think it would be a little hard if it was on the bottom, because when you're turning your compost, you'd probably end up poking it with a pitchfork. But the idea is a good one, and it'll both extend your seasons before everything freezes, and it will also contribute to everything heating up more quickly in the spring, summer, and fall. Some of you might recognize this. It's called a Jora or a Yora. It's a tumbler. I included this photo because it's winter composting and it's got snow on it. But actually, you can't see what I want you to see, which is that, first of all, there's 2 chambers. There's a latch and there's a latch. And when you open those doors, it's actually really, really insulated. It's got 4-inch foam insulation inside the chambers. So you can get really hot compost in a Jora, even though the mass that you have isn't very big. But even the Joras will freeze solid at some point in the winter. So I guess I'm just saying, don't expect that you're going to somehow be able to manage your compost without it freezing solid, unless you bring it inside. Which I know one person who bought one of these Joras and she set it up in her garage, and she was composting and it was hot all winter long. But not all of us have a garage where we can do that. Just one more example of what a good system for the winter. At first, I thought these were weird looking bins. I've never seen anything like those before. This was another stock image we found online. But I like it because it shows the 2 bins. And I suspect, now that I look at it harder, that this is actually some kind of insulation that's wrapped around a cylinder bin that looks more like my bins. And this is the brown storage. So you can't see what's in them, but you can tell they've got 2 bins and storage for their browns. And you can also tell they haven't been out there in a while because there's no footprints, and the snow looks pristine on top of them. But that's the concept. Okay, I want to talk about the trash can. So when we get to the question section, I'd love for Theron to tell us more about what he did, because he's done this. I've done it, and we've both done it differently. This is a great example. I like this idea of just getting a basic rolling cart. You can get these at hardware stores. And that way, when, and this is what you would keep by your backyard, by your back door, or even on a porch. And you would just add your food scraps and your browns, just like you would in a compost bin, and you do it all winter. And then in the spring, I like this rolling cart idea because then you just roll it out to your bin. I actually did it with a really cheap black plastic, like cylinder shaped covered trash can that I bought at a local hardware store. It was very, very cheap, flimsy, but it was black and it was more of a cylinder. It didn't have the wheels. And this was one year I lived in town. I didn't even have like 4 square feet for a yard, I don't think. But I did compost in that trash can all winter, and somehow I was able to convince a neighbor to let me set up a bin in their yard. And I managed to get the food scraps out to that bin in the spring. And you should be aware, just like any of this food scraps and browns that are collecting all winter long, when it gets to be spring and time to manage them, whether it's in a bin or in like a temporary, it's going to be a little smelly when you turn it for that first time in the spring. And if you're adding your browns and turning regularly, that it's really only going to be that one time in the spring when you have a smell. You turn it, you add more browns, you let it rest, and the smell goes away. But just so you're aware, like even with all of the things that we're doing, when you're adding your food scraps and your browns all winter long, it's really hard to get in there and aerate it, and they do tend to get a little bit more packed down than we like. if you think of getting out there and turning the compost when we have warm days, if you can, that's a good idea. But if you can't, just as long as you know, just because there might be a smell the first time you turn it in the spring, doesn't mean you're always going to have smelly compost. It just means that's what happens, you know, when it's been sitting all winter. Okay, I see a ton of questions coming in. I'm almost done. I just want to talk to you about bokashi compost. Can people use the raising the hand function and raise your hands if you've ever tried bokashi? Maybe most of you haven't even heard of it. It's a little bit esoteric. Oh, a couple of people have. Good. Yeah, it's a really great system. I think it originated in Japan and actually in cities where people were in like high-rise apartments as a way of managing food scraps that, you know, without having a backyard bin. There's a couple of advantages about it. And if you are already composting, I think of this as a really great add-on for the winter, because the way that bokashi works is it actually ferments your food scraps in these pails, and they don't smell bad. And you can have them in your kitchen for a long time before you have to manage those buckets. So I used this example. This is the kit that I actually purchased because I actually just wanted to test it out to see if it was anything that I would want to talk to people about. I don't talk about this in our basics, compost basics. But the reason I think it's a really good system is because you've got 4 gallons here. Okay. You add your food scraps. You can see this is a tap, and it shows a cup here because the tap is for, as the materials are fermenting, you can drain out the liquid, and you have to dilute it. I think the ratio is like 1 to 100, you know, this liquid to water. So it's a very, very diluted, but you can add it as like a little fertilizer to your houseplants. And some people use it as a drain cleaner because it has a lot of microorganisms in it. So you take these trays, they go at the bottom of the pail, and that just blocks food scraps from getting into the tap. And some people even use like a potato masher. So when you put your food scraps in, you mash them down, because this is not composting, this is fermenting. You want it really like packed down. And then you sprinkle this, this is a bran that comes with the kit, and the bran activates the fermentation process. And that's all you do. So you add your food scraps, you sprinkle on the bran, you mash it down, you close the container and seal it. You don't smell a thing. You will smell it when you open the container, and it smells like sauerkraut. It just smells like if you've ever fermented your own food for kimchi or sauerkraut, it's got to smell like that. I had one of these. I wanted to see how long I could keep it in my kitchen. Basically, it never smelled bad. And I got to 2 months, 2 months of food scraps in there. They don't rot and they don't smell bad. You still have to manage them. So they're not done once they're in the bucket. But if you want to, you just compost through the winter, but you don't want to go outside as frequently as you normally do, having a system like this just means, okay, like you don't have to wait 2 months. Maybe every month you take one of these pails and then you would put that into your regular compost system. Some people will just bury it in their garden, which is you could save them to the spring and do it that way too. I have 3 of these buckets, so I figure either I'm just going to empty them throughout the winter, or I might, even though I have an empty bin, I might wait and deal with them all in the spring. So this doesn't mean you don't have to compost it and add browns when it goes into your bin. It just means that you're fermenting, which means all these wonderful microorganisms, even if you don't have to store them for a long time, it really inoculates your compost pile and kickstarts the whole process. And it also means if you want to, you could let them sit for a while before you go outside and just kind of cut down on the number of trips you make outside. And in our follow-up email, we're going to include a link to an article that has more information about bokashi. You don't have to buy a kit. You can make your own bucket with a tap. You can make your own fermentation brand. I forgot the name of it. There's a special name, but it's a little bit of a process. I found it easier to just buy it, but you can definitely make your own if you don't want to buy something. Okay, finally, I just want to conclude by saying that you really can compost through the winter. It's okay to cold compost, even when everything freezes. We all know with composting, in order to get to that finished product, you either need time or temperature. And in this sense, we're just extending the time. And if you're composting in the winter, I would say realistically, it's probably a year from when you start to when you have finished compost. But it could be a lot less than that if you're managing it when the weather warms up. It could be 6 months. And I want to end by saying that this is a view into Theron's compost bin. And I'm going to let him speak to this in a minute. But what he told me was this beautiful, almost finished compost here actually was from his trash can compost, where he had been keeping food scraps all winter. He had put it in his bin, added his browns, mixed it. And I believe it was only, maybe it's time for Theron to hop on. It might have been like a month or two. Not very long after he started, did he get this really beautiful compost. So I'm going to go to our final slide. And Theron, actually, let's just hear what Theron has to say about this, because it's kind of neat.
Yeah, so that's a picture of the compost from my compost system in about August. And that material, at least some of it, was started in the spring. I think it was about February. And I started collecting food scraps and browns, wood shavings in a trash can in the driveway, because it was too far for me to get to the compost bin. Well, actually, I don't think I had built the compost bin yet at that point. So I collected the food scraps and the browns in the trash can. I built the compost bin, and I added them in, and we added food scraps all summer and watered it and turned it. And this is a picture after it was freshly turned. But as you can see, most of it is already pretty much processed. So this bin ended up getting full from, I'd say, a family of 4 over the course of maybe 8 months. And then we have since then stopped adding material to it. We're going to let it sit until spring. And by then, I think that, well, by the time it's time to do gardening again in the late spring, all that material should be fully composted and ready to use on the garden.
Nice. Also, I just want to point out, this is Theron, this is the one you built, right?
Yeah, that's right.
This is from, again, we'll send you a link to the designs. It's a really great design, and Theron designed it and built it. But notice how the bin is totally lined with hardware cloth. So it really is designed so no animals or rodents can get in, and it has wonderful aeration too.
I actually had to put hardware cloth and boards because we had a bear in the area. So
good point.
Yep.
So Amanda, I see so many questions and comments. Can you hop on and start going through them with us?
Yeah, we've got some questions. So I'm going to start with these two just because they seem to be about the bokashi, and that's fresh. So we've got one from Judy about, is the liquid from the bokashi compost tea? And then one doing with containing fruit flies when you're composting indoors, from Kathleen.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about the bokashi liquid. First of all, on bokashi, there's no fruit flies. The materials are immediately fermenting. I have never seen fruit flies on the bokashi. And the liquid that you drain is not compost tea, although I can see why you'd think that. Compost tea is actually when you take finished compost, and that is literally like in some kind of a bag in water, and you draw the nutrients out into the water and then use that on your garden. The liquid draining from the bokashi is really a fermented, it's pretty acidic actually, and it doesn't really have as many nutrients as compost tea. That's why it's recommended, because it's so acidic, it's actually recommended that it is diluted at a rate of 1 to 100. So 1 part liquid to 100 parts water. It's a really diluted mix. I've read articles about it where some people say it doesn't really fertilize your plants at all. Other people think it does. But nobody argues the fact that if you pour it straight down your drain, the microorganisms in that liquid will kind of like, I guess, deal with some of the stuff that builds up on the inside of our plumbing. So the short answer is no, it's not compost tea. And the other one was about fruit flies in general.
I think I wasn't specific whether it was about the bokashi or about worm composting, but it was just about containing fruit flies indoors.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it and I'll invite either of you to pipe in when I'm done. So the most likely scenario of having fruit flies indoors is when you've got your food scraps in a countertop pail. We aren't recommending that you compost indoors other than the bokashi, which is a little bit different. And you can even keep that on a porch or something. The temporary like trash can is something that you would keep outside your living space. But if you have a food scraps on your counter, typically fruit flies come in with citrus peels, banana peels. Those come with fruit fly, shall we say, eggs already embedded into them. And they will hatch out and become, so that's one thing. If you eat a lot of citrus or bananas, you might see some fruit flies. And the solution is just get that stuff out to your bin as soon as possible. The other reason that fruit flies come is often in harvest season. For me, when I have a lot of tomatoes from the garden, I get fruit flies. One way to contain them is just setting up little homemade fruit fly traps. I'm not a big fan of these, compost bins that claim to have filters and blah, blah, blah. I've never seen that make any difference whatsoever. And Theron, do you have anything to add to containing fruit flies?
No, I mean, you can always just bring your food scraps out more frequently, and yeah, you can make a trap with a little bit of vinegar or wine and some dish soap. So.
All right.
We actually, because the question was asked, we actually do have a handout that we could include. We're going to send you a bunch of resources in your follow-up email, and I'll make a note to include the fruit fly handout too.
All right, so we had one more question that came in about the bokashi, which is, can you keep it in a cold garage?
You can. I think what is likely in the winter is it'll probably freeze, just like anything else. What I would do is I'd keep it in my kitchen or just outside my door until the bin was full. And then if you didn't want to get it into your compost bin right away, then you could store it in the cold garage. But it will freeze. Just be aware of that. You'll end up with I can't say this word, composticle. Somebody say that better than me. But it certainly, you can put it there. I don't know what that does to the fermentation process. It might not be ideal. I should do a little more research about that.
All right, and then we have a couple questions about worm composting in the winter. So one of them is, do you think insulating the worm bin will keep the worms going during the winter? And another is just, do you have a good DIY for making a worm composting bin in the winter?
Okay, well, we can send the DIY, we do, and we'll send it out. You're gonna have a really long list of resources when you get your follow-up email, but that's great. They won't all be for everybody, but click on the ones you like. So there are, but worm bins, I don't really think they should be outside in Vermont in the winter. If your goal is to vermicompost, even with insulation, you might want to talk to somebody who's a little bit more of an expert at worm bins than I am, but I have never seen anything, even an insulated bin, not freeze at some point during the winter. And I wouldn't recommend, if you're going to do vermicomposting, it's very unlikely you're going to have the mass that you would need for it not to freeze solid. So I would keep that indoors for the winter. If you have a basement or some kind of a like porch or shed area that's at least partially insulated. Darren, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
So then Barbara has a question. Is it okay to open compost in the winter year round? She doesn't want to buy plastic containers.
What do you mean open compost?
I think like open pile compost.
Yeah, pile, which we don't recommend. And it's mostly because if you're composting food scraps, it's going to attract animals, whether that's the neighbor's dog or raccoons, or if you're in a city, it might be rats. Generally speaking, we want people to compost properly, and that means keeping animals out. So some sort of enclosed bin is what we recommend. And if you don't have time to set that up between now and winter, as we said, there's a bunch of different options. You can bring it to a drop-off site. You could ask a neighbor if they already have a system set up.
One thing I didn't talk about in this presentation that you could do, it won't 100% prevent animals, but I have seen people set up what they call hay bale compost, where you literally just make a square of straw or hay bales, and then the compost goes in the middle. You'll get rodents in that, no question about it. But that might, if you don't have time to set up a composter that's not plastic, like a pre-made bin, that might be a quick way to get started for this winter. But again, part of our role is to not only encourage managing food scraps in a way that doesn't attract animals, but make sure it's really successful. And sometimes attracting wildlife, if you live out in the woods or out in the country and you don't have a lot of neighbors too close by, that's fine. But if you live anywhere in a town or on a street with other people, if your system starts to attract like raccoons or skunks or rats, then it becomes a bigger problem for the whole neighborhood, and that's what we want to avoid.
Right. And we have a few questions about, read Linda's. If organics are not available, is newspaper or shredded cardboard an acceptable alternative to browns?
Do you want to take that, Darren?
Like that.
Yeah, sure. They are. You just want to make sure that they're not coated with anything. So you don't want any plastic or wax on those paper or cardboard products. Otherwise, they won't break down. But yeah, you can use shredded paper. It's just made from trees, so.
Yeah, I would just add to that emphasis on the shredded, and also that shredded paper, cardboard, newspaper, even egg cartons are totally legitimate browns, but they're not going to be effective if that's all you use. They just don't have the heft that you need, or can't think of the word, but you need a little bit more structure to them. So I would say go ahead and do that, but work on finding something. And if you have $6 to spare, it might be worth buying that bale of wood shavings somewhere, or find a wood mill or wood shop to get something free, just so that you, and also add your paper and cardboard. But at some point, even if you can't do it in the winter and the spring, you should be adding other browns as well.
All right, so we've got a couple more questions about browns. So one person asks, what is the wood shavings place in Barrie that Theron goes to get his wood shavings?
Treehouse, or actually it's called Wilson Woodworks now.
All right. And Miriam wants to know, why do you need to keep your browns covered?
It's to keep them dry. And what I wanted to add onto the browns, one of the big pieces of why they're effective is that they suck up some of the moisture from the food scraps. They balance it out and keep it from getting too wet. Because if it's too wet, there's no oxygen getting in there, and it becomes that anaerobic environment that is not hospitable to the microorganisms that you're trying to encourage.
All right. And then we have some questions about bears. As Nat says, just what about bears? If you're using the proper browns, will it keep bears away? Questions about bears.
So should have anticipated that. We actually have a whole section just on bears in our Compost Basics webinar, and we will send that to you. And we also have some handouts about composting in bear country. The short answer is that browns will help, but they won't keep bears away. But the long answer is that bears do not come to your yard for your compost. If there's a bear in your neighborhood, that doesn't mean that they don't get into your compost. It means what attracts them in the first place is if somebody has been feeding the birds during the time when bears start, usually it's spring when they're just coming out of hibernation, or if there, some people actually just feed bears. But if there's something like that, that's like, they can smell that stuff from over a mile away. And then if they're in the neighborhood and they smell something that smells like food, they'll go after it, but they're not coming out of the woods for that, which means there's a lot of steps you can take along the way. One is just making sure there's no bird feeders out, not only in your house, but also your neighbors, which is trickier. The other is because their noses are so sensitive, you can use that and put out a harsh chemical like ammonia. You soak a rag with ammonia and you put it near your compost system, and the bears hate that. They will stay away from that. That's something that we learned from the Vermont's bear biologist, Forrest Hammond. But no, yeah, we also, it's true that if you're adding your browns in the ratio of 3 parts browns to 1 part greens, which is food scraps, that will contribute to reducing smells and composting your materials more quickly. So that won't be the only thing that eliminates bears, but it will help. And I would invite either of you to chime in with other thoughts on bears.
Yeah, we have a whole section on it in our other webinar on basic composting. I'd recommend that you check that out, and we'll send some resources. I also want to point out that this is winter composting, and bears hibernate during the winter. So so it's not too much of an issue during the winter, but if you're composting properly, using the proper ratios and recipes, like Cassandra said, it's going to keep the smells down, and it's going to keep them from being interested in it.
All right. And Susan has a question about, she wants a little bit more information about successfully using a green cone in the winter.
Mm-hmm. I can speak to that. I've been using a green cone for a couple of years now, and I primarily use it for meat and bones, but I'm also using it for food scraps at this point. It does freeze down at the bottom, and that's okay. It's insulated. It has 2 layers, so when the sun hits it, it warms up, and you can actually see it sort of steams and builds up moisture on the inside, even on a cold day. But it does continue to work. It slows down in the winter, and it often gets snow on top. So I would recommend not turning the latch on the top. Just leave it in the open position so that you can easily open it and close it. Yeah, it works much the same.
Right. Barbara just has a question about, I think, Act 148 related, about how grocery stores and restaurants are dealing with the compost mandate on a larger scale.
So that question is something that, it's a good question. And grocery stores, restaurants, institutions like Norwich University, universities, hospitals, they have been composting or managing their food scraps since 2014. And in central Vermont, we actually used to run for about 13 years. We run a food scrap hauling program, and a lot of those institutions have been composting their food scraps since as early as 2004. So they work with a commercial food scrap hauler. They have special totes, just like you see at the drop-off sites. They put their food scraps in the totes. The hauler takes it away once a week, and it goes to a commercial composting facility. And that system works very well, and it's been in place for a very long time in central Vermont. It's a little bit newer in other parts of the state. Our district was sort of on the cutting edge of getting that started in the early 2000s. But yeah, it's a pretty tight system at this point. And there's more, we no longer haul food scraps, but there's a number of companies that do.
All right, so Marcy has a question about, I'm assuming it's bear related, about when it's safe to put out her feeders in Vermont. Is it okay to do so now?
No, the bears are still out. I would say December to March or so.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. In the other months, the bears are going to be awake, especially in the late fall, like right now, and the early spring, when they're either trying to fatten up for hibernation or when they're waking up and hungry. those are the real issue times. But they will be around and looking for food in the warmer months. So do take your feeders down between March and December, I'd say.
All right. Then we have one last question about composting, which is Rachel says, I used my compost in my garden this summer. I ended up with 25 squash that I didn't plant. Could it maybe be that I didn't use enough browns?
No, that's just going to happen.
Squash are very tenacious. The seeds sometimes survive.
Squash and tomatoes. Yeah. No, it's just that when we compost in our backyard, like the household level composting is very rare to get the volume you need to get hot composting. And hot composting is a certain temperature range between 141 degrees Fahrenheit and 160. And then it has to stay that way for a certain period of time. And if your compost gets to that temperature range, it will kill all the seeds. But that's not going to happen in a backyard system. You have to have a certain amount of mass, and that the minimum mass is 3 feet by 3 feet. So it's in community composting sites that can happen, commercial composting sites that can happen. But in our backyards, it won't. And it's not a terrible problem to have more squash than you planned. I mean, you'll get weird hybrids and everything, but you can weed them out. I usually get a bunch of tomatoes that I didn't plan either. I actually got a gorgeous summer squash that volunteered out of that bin that I showed you the picture of that's now empty, that had all my curing compost in it. Over the summer, this summer squash just blew up out of that thing. It was literally growing inside the bin, and I got a lot of fruit off of it. I was very happy about that.
All right, and then the only other thing in the question box is that Linda had a comment about the fruit flies, saying that if you have a lot of indoor plants, they could be soil gnats and not fruit flies. And then one person in the chat box seems to have a question, and it's that she has rabbits. Their hay is Timothy, and the litter is comprised of wheat. Are there any browns in this? I normally throw all their waste in the compost bin.
Yeah, definitely throw it in the bin. I actually was looking for rabbit manure and got some from somebody who had like a little like carrying tote of, and it was mostly browns. It's fine to put in your compost.
Yeah, I would mention that the rabbit manure itself is probably going to, and urine, which is probably in there, it's going to be high in nitrogen. So, I mean, you want to have a good balance of nitrogen and carbon in your compost, but it sounds like if you're adding the hay and the other materials, you should be fine.
All right, and that's all we have, unless anyone else has a question right away. That's all we've got.
Okay, wonderful. Well, listen, keep an eye on your email. We use Constant Contact, so you'll get an email from the district through Constant Contact. We will include, it's going to be a pretty long list of resources, including a link to the recording of this webinar, and we'll include a link to the recording of our Compost Basics webinar. But if you don't feel like watching through another webinar, we also have a composting booklet that will send you the link to that. And you can reach out to any of us at any time if you have any further questions. Oh, we have a couple raised hands. Anything else?
See. All right, if anyone with the raised hands wants to plug in their question.
They might be saying goodbye.
Or they might just be saying goodbye, so.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.